The first time she walked into the base gym, all eyes turned her way. She wasn't dressed like the others, no crisp military t-shirts, no gray sweats with regulation sneakers, but rather a simple black tank top, faded running shoes that had clearly seen better days. Her skin glistened from the heat outside, and her braided hair was tied back tight so it wouldn't get in the way. Some of the men on the benches glanced at her, then at one another, and smirked as if they already had their jokes ready. She didn't flinch, didn't care, just walked straight to the free weights as though she belonged there as much as anyone else. On her left arm, bold and unapologetic, stretched a tattoo of a trident wrapped in chains, the design inked in deep blue and black that seemed to shine even under the harsh fluorescent lights. For a moment, silence hung in the air before one of the younger recruits burst into laughter. "Look at that," he said loud enough for the whole room to hear. "She thinks she's a SEAL." The others chuckled, some hiding it behind their hands, some not even bothering. She heard them, of course. She always heard them. But she kept her face calm, set her jaw, and curled the barbell in her hands with slow, steady power that revealed muscles built not from vanity but from discipline. The laughter rose again as another voice chimed in. "Yeah, maybe she got it off a sticker pack, or maybe she's trying to impress her boyfriend." That got a round of chuckles that echoed across the room. She placed the barbell down without a sound, wiped her palms on her shorts, and lifted her gaze to them at last. Her eyes were sharp, dark, and unblinking, and for just a second, some of them shifted uneasily but none enough to stop. They didn't know her name, not yet, only saw what they wanted to see. A black woman in a room full of men who thought she didn't belong. What they didn't know was that tattoo wasn't just a decoration, wasn't a fashion statement, and wasn't bought in some back alley parlor. It had been earned, paid for with sweat, exhaustion, scars, and silence. Each chain in the design marked a week of training, each curve of the trident represented a phase of trials she had fought through, and the ink had been placed on her arm not by some artist looking for cash but by a Navy SEAL who had stood beside her in the mud, the cold, and the endless nights of drills. She could have explained all that, could have told them the story, but she had learned long ago that explanations didn't matter. Only proof did. Proof in silence, in strength, in patience. So she simply reached for heavier weights, set herself into motion again, and let them watch if they wanted. Their laughter grew into whispers, some of them imitating her behind her back, but she didn't let it cut into her. Every curl of her arms, every pull of the weights was another reminder to herself of what she had endured, what she had fought to earn. She could still remember the endless swims in icy water, the mud covering every inch of her skin, the hunger and the bruises and the endless ringing in her ears from instructors shouting until their voices cracked. That tattoo wasn't something she had chosen to wear, it was something she had survived to carry. The recruits didn't know, but the older men did. A few of the senior petty officers in the corner caught sight of her tattoo and stopped their chatter mid-sentence. One of them leaned forward, squinting as if to be sure he wasn't mistaken. He muttered something to his friend, and the expression on his face wasn't amusement but recognition. Still he didn't speak, didn't stop the laughter around her, only waited. The gym echoed with the clang of weights and the rhythm of running on treadmills, but in the background there was a shift, a tension almost invisible unless you were looking for it. She kept her head down, kept working, until the room fell into a hush none of the laughing recruits expected. The door had opened, and in walked a man whose presence instantly changed the air. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the calm expression of someone who didn't need to shout to command respect. His uniform, his boots carried the dust of somewhere he had just returned from, and the bars on his chest announced his authority clearly. More important than any of that, though, was the insignia stitched onto his sleeve. Every man in the room straightened when they saw it, because it meant only one thing: a SEAL commander had just entered. His eyes swept the room, not pausing for long on anyone until they fell on her. He stopped. For a heartbeat, the recruits thought he might call her out, question why she was there, maybe even add his own remark to the laughter. Instead, he took one long step forward, then another, until he was standing directly in front of her. The room had gone dead quiet now, even the machines seemed to have silenced themselves. She looked up at him, still breathing steady from her set, and for a moment the two of them simply stared. Then, without a word, he placed his hands at his sides, straightened his spine, and stood at full attention before her. The room gasped, the recruits frozen in disbelief, because they had never seen a commander offer that to anyone in this space, let alone to someone they had mocked only moments before. The silence after the commander's gesture was heavier than any weight in the gym. None of the recruits dared to move, their earlier smirks frozen into shapes of confusion and disbelief. She didn't blink, didn't rise, only stared back at him with the same calm steadiness she had carried since the moment she walked in. In her mind, the memory of recognition sparked because she had seen him before, not in this gym, not even on this base, but in the crucible of training where men broke and only a few stood again. He had been there, one of the instructors who didn't shout the loudest but whose silence was more punishing than any roar. She remembered him walking along the shore at night, watching with eyes that never softened as candidates shivered in the freezing surf, checking if they had it in them to keep going. He had been the one who, without a word, tossed her an extra canteen when her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, not out of kindness but as a test. Could she drink and keep running without faltering? That memory burned in her chest now as he held himself in respect before her. The recruits couldn't understand, that what tied them together wasn't spoken aloud. It was a language written in exhaustion, in shared pain, in survival. Finally, his voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried through every inch of the gym. "Ma'am," he said simply, nodding once, a gesture that carried more weight than any salute. Then he turned, sweeping the room with his eyes, locking each recruit in his stare one by one. "You boys have the nerve to laugh at a warrior whose scars you couldn't even carry for a day?" His words landed like thunder, striking harder than any rebuke they'd ever heard. One by one, the recruits looked down at their shoes, shame creeping into their faces as the commander's tone cut through them. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. His quiet words carried the authority of someone who had watched men drown, collapse, or quit in places harsher than any gym. "That tattoo," he continued, pointing to her arm, "was earned where most of you would have begged to go home before the first hour was through." The recruits shifted uncomfortably, some swallowing hard, others gripping their towels tighter. None dared to speak. She still hadn't said a word and she didn't need to. Her silence was its own weapon, sharper than anything they could throw at her. Inside though, she remembered how the tattoo had been inked in the back of a barracks by a fellow trainee who could barely keep his hands steady from exhaustion but who had wanted to mark the victory of surviving a phase that had destroyed most of their class. She remembered the taste of salt water, the ache of muscles that never had time to heal, the moments when her body screamed to stop and she told it no. And most of all, she remembered the faces of those who hadn't made it, friends who had been pulled from the water, dragged from the sand, carried away with blank eyes that had lost their fire. That tattoo was for them as much as for herself. Every chain in its design was a memory of one who had fallen. That was why the commander stood at attention, because he remembered too. He turned back to her then, his expression softening only by a fraction, enough that she knew he was speaking not to impress anyone, but to acknowledge truth. "They'll learn," he said quietly so only she could hear. "One way or another they'll learn." She gave the slightest nod, her lips pressing together in something that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it vanished quickly. She picked up the weights again, her arms steady, her movements precise. The commander stepped back, still watching, then finally broke his stance and moved toward the door. But before he left, he paused, looked over his shoulder and said to the recruits, "If you're half the soldiers she is, maybe one day you'll earn the right to stand in this room without shame." With that he left, the door closing behind him. The sound echoed, final and sharp. The gym remained frozen. Some of the recruits glanced at her, guilt plain on their faces, but none dared to laugh again. A few tried to mumble apologies but she ignored them, not out of cruelty but because she knew words meant nothing. They would forget their apologies the moment they left unless they chose to change. She had learned not to rely on promises. Only actions proved who someone really was. She racked the weights carefully, wiped her hands again and stood tall. The gym no longer felt hostile, it felt conquered. Without a word, she walked to the treadmill, turned it on and began to run. Her strides were long, strong, steady, and unbroken, as if to remind anyone watching that she wasn't there to be accepted. She was there to exist and no one could take that away from her. As she ran, her mind drifted back to the night she'd finished Hell Week, the grueling crucible that broke even the strongest. She could still hear the pounding surf, the endless orders, the brutal cold. She could still feel the burn in her lungs when she thought she couldn't move another step. And yet, when morning came she was still standing, still breathing, still ready. She remembered the look in the instructor's eyes that day, one of them being the very same commander who had just stood for her. They hadn't congratulated her. They hadn't praised her. They had only nodded, the smallest acknowledgement that she had proven herself. That was all she had needed. And now, years later, standing in this gym with strangers who didn't know her story, she realized it still meant everything. The recruits finally began to scatter. Some avoided her eyes, others glanced at her tattoo with newfound respect, their earlier laughter replaced with a silence they didn't know how to fill. But she didn't care for their approval. She had carried herself through worse storms than their mockery. And as the treadmill carried her forward, sweat running down her face, she knew that this was only another test, another reminder that the world would always doubt, always laugh, always challenge. That was fine. She had never needed the world to believe in her. She had only needed to keep going. That night, long after the incident in the gym, she sat alone in her quarters, the room dim except for the faint light of a desk lamp. Her duffel bag was tucked under the bunk, her boots aligned neatly against the wall, everything arranged with the discipline that had been drilled into her since training. Yet her mind wasn't quiet. The laughter from earlier still echoed faintly in her ears, not because it had wounded her, but because it reminded her how people dismissed what they didn't understand. She leaned back in her chair, arms folded, her eyes drifting to the tattoo etched on her skin. Running her fingers along the ink, she felt the texture of the scars beneath, reminders that the trident wasn't just a symbol of victory, it was a record of endurance, carved into her body as much as her memory. For years she had carried it without needing validation. But the commander's gesture earlier had stirred something inside her that she hadn't expected. A reminder that she wasn't invisible, that someone who mattered had acknowledged her place. Her thoughts pulled her back to the day she had first considered quitting. It was in the middle of Hell Week, when her body had been reduced to little more than raw nerves and instinct. She could still hear the instructors barking commands, their voices cutting through the roar of the surf. Keep moving, candidates. The ocean doesn't care about your pain. Every muscle in her body had screamed to collapse. She remembered crawling through the mud with sand grinding into her eyes, her knees bleeding, her lungs heaving against the cold. One by one, others around her had dropped out. Some had begged for mercy, others had gone silent, carried away by medics. She had stared at the bell in the distance, the brass bell that candidates could ring if they wanted out, and for a moment she had been tempted. That bell wasn't just an exit, it was a promise of warmth, of rest, of escape. But then she had looked at the others, at the handful who were still fighting forward, and she thought of the faces of people who had told her she couldn't do it because she was a woman, because she was black, because she didn't fit the image they thought a SEAL should have. And something in her hardened. She turned away from the bell and threw herself back into the mud, refusing to let them be right. That was the night she had earned the first chain in her tattoo's design. The knock at her door pulled her out of the memory. She straightened instantly, instincts snapping into place. When she opened the door, the last person she expected was standing there, the commander himself. His posture was as rigid as it had been in the gym, but his face was calmer, less formal. "Permission to enter?" he asked. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He didn't sit right away, only glanced around the room as though taking in the simplicity of her quarters. Then he finally lowered himself onto the chair opposite her bunk. For a long moment he didn't speak, and neither did she. The air was thick with unspoken recognition, the kind that hit. Finally he said, "You carried yourself well today. Better than most would have under that kind of mockery." She shrugged, not dismissing his words but showing she didn't crave praise. "Mockery's easy," she replied quietly. "Hell Week was hard." He gave a faint smile at that, nodding. Then his expression grew serious. "You know, they don't understand, most of them. They see the tattoo but they don't know what it cost. They don't know what you've done. But I do." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "And I'll make sure they learn." She studied him carefully, searching his face for any trace of pity, but there was none. Only respect. It mattered to her more than she wanted to admit. She set her elbows on her knees, staring at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "I didn't come here to be believed. I came here to keep proving I belong, even when nobody's watching." His answer was firm, "That's why you belong more than anyone." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, but it was the kind of weight that steadies instead of crushes. He finally stood, preparing to leave, but before he did, he glanced at the tattoo again. "Every chain in that design," he said slowly, "know what it cost you. Don't let their ignorance cheapen it." With that, he gave her a final nod and left. She sat back down, the sound of the door closing echoing in her ears. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a deep breath that felt lighter than usual. Later that night, as she lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling, she thought of what tomorrow would bring. The recruits would whisper, of course, and word would spread. Maybe some would respect her more, maybe others would resent her. But none of that mattered. She had lived her life pushing through doubt, and tomorrow would be no different. What did matter, though, was the commander's acknowledgement. In a world that measured worth by survival and strength, That silent gesture of standing at attention was worth more than 1,000 speeches. It wasn't just validation. It was a reminder that she had earned her place in ways most would never understand. And that thought carried her into sleep, steady as the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The next morning dawned with the sharp whistle of reveille, the kind of sound that jolted everyone from their bunks whether they were ready or not. She was already awake, of course. She had risen before dawn, as she always did, lacing her boots in silence and pushing through a routine that belonged more to ritual than necessity. By the time the others scrambled from their beds, she had already run 2 miles along the perimeter of the base and returned with her pulse steady, her breathing calm. To her, this wasn't about proving herself anymore. It was about rhythm, about living the way she had learned to survive, by never stopping, never giving her body or mind permission to grow lazy. As she stepped into the mess hall, trays clattering and voices filling the air, she could feel eyes on her again. Some recruits glanced quickly away when she caught their gaze, others stared longer, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, embarrassment, and something closer to respect. No one laughed. Not after yesterday. She carried her tray to a table by herself, unbothered by the empty seats around her. Loneliness had never been her enemy, it had always been her shield. But this morning something was different. A pair of boots scraped the floor, and when she looked up, she saw one of the younger recruits, the very one who had laughed the loudest yesterday, standing awkwardly beside her. His face was pale, his jaw tight as though he was swallowing words he didn't know how to speak. Finally he said, "Can I sit?" She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, only gave a slight shrug. He sat down quickly, hands fidgeting with his fork. For a long moment he didn't eat, didn't look up. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I didn't know. About the tattoo. About you." She chewed her food slowly, watching him. His shame wasn't enough for forgiveness, but at least it was honest. "You didn't need to know," she said finally. "You just needed to keep your mouth shut." He winced at that, nodding. "You're right. I was wrong." Others at nearby tables had noticed, their conversations faltering as they tried to listen without being obvious. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make a show of it. She leaned slightly closer to the recruit and said, "You think being here is about proving who's strongest? About who can shout the loudest? It's not. It's about who can endure when everything inside you says quit. That's what the trident means. Endurance." He swallowed hard, his eyes lowering. "I get it now." She almost smiled, almost. Instead, she gave a simple nod and returned to her food, dismissing him without another word. He sat there a moment longer, then quietly excused himself, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his own lesson. The others saw it too, and though none approached her directly, the air around her shifted. She wasn't just the woman with the tattoo anymore. She was the standard they had to measure themselves against. After breakfast came drills, the kind of punishing exercises designed to grind arrogance out of anyone who carried it. Running with weighted packs, crawling under wire, hauling logs through the sand. The sun was merciless, the sweat stung their eyes, and recruits dropped one by one, gasping for breath, cursing under their breaths. She moved steadily, never the fastest but never breaking stride, her face unreadable, her body moving with the rhythm of someone who had long ago accepted that pain was her constant companion. The same recruit who had approached her at breakfast struggled beside her, his legs buckling, his shoulders trembling under the log they carried together. She didn't speak, didn't encourage him, but when he nearly fell, she shifted just enough to take more of the weight without making it obvious. He noticed, though, and the look in his eyes wasn't just gratitude, it was the realization that she was stronger than he had ever been, not because she shouted about it, but because she proved it in silence. By midday, whispers had spread beyond the recruits. Senior officers had heard about the scene in the gym, about the commander's gesture, about the tattoo. Some scoffed privately, dismissing it as exaggeration, but others grew curious. That evening she was summoned to the commander's office. She arrived promptly, her uniform sharp, her boots polished, her bearing as disciplined as the day she had first stepped into training. He greeted her with a nod and gestured for her to sit. "Word travels fast," he said simply, his tone neither pleased nor angry. "You've stirred something among the men." She didn't flinch. "That wasn't my intention." His lips twitched faintly, almost a smile. "I know. But sometimes the truth stirs whether we intend it or not." He leaned back, studying her carefully. "You understand what your presence means here, don't you? To them? To the ones who laughed and even to the ones who didn't." She held his gaze, unshaken. "It means they'll have to face their own weakness when they look at me." He nodded slowly. "Exactly. And some will hate you for it. Others will learn. That's the burden you carry." She didn't argue. She had always known the burden, always felt its weight. It wasn't new. But hearing him say it aloud, acknowledging it, made it more real somehow. He stood then, walking to the window that overlooked the training field where recruits still struggled under the weight of logs and packs. "I've seen men break under less than what you've endured," he said quietly. "You didn't just survive Hell Week. You've survived everything after it too. That's why I stood for you yesterday. Not for the ink on your arm, but for what it means." Her throat tightened, but she kept her expression composed. She rose to her feet, her posture straight. "Then I'll keep carrying it," she said firmly. He turned back to her, his eyes steady. "I know you will. That's why you're here." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, with unspoken respect, with the weight of shared memory. When he dismissed her, she walked out into the evening air, the sky painted in streaks of red and gold. The recruits were still out there, still sweating, still stumbling through drills. She watched them for a moment, then turned toward her quarters, her steps steady. She knew tomorrow would bring more tests, more doubts, more whispers. But she also knew she was ready. Because she always had been. The days that followed unfolded like a slow turning of tides. What had begun as laughter in the gym turned into whispers of caution, then into quiet stares of respect. Not everyone was. Some of the recruits still carried bitterness in their eyes, unwilling to let go of the idea that someone so different from them could embody what they themselves struggled to achieve. But others had started to watch her more closely, not with mockery but with curiosity, studying the way she moved during drills, the way she handled herself in the face of fatigue, the way she never once complained. To them, she became less of an outsider and more of a mirror, reflecting the reality of their own weaknesses. She didn't seek to inspire anyone, didn't speak or posture as a leader, yet somehow, without meaning to, she became a presence they couldn't ignore. It was during a night exercise that the shift became undeniable. The recruits were ordered into the woods for a navigation drill, each carrying a pack and a map with coordinates they had to reach under strict time. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to skin and made every step heavier. The forest floor was uneven, roots twisting underfoot, shadows swallowing light from the moon. One by one, recruits stumbled, cursed, grew frustrated. She moved steadily, her compass steady in her hand, her eyes scanning the terrain with the quiet patience of someone who had done this under far worse conditions. Memories returned of bearings and storms when even the stars vanished behind clouds. Compared to that, this forest was manageable. She kept her pace, weaving through trees with the focus of someone who knew that the real challenge wasn't the terrain, but the fight against exhaustion. An hour into the exercise, a cry split the air. One of the recruits had tripped over a root and twisted his ankle badly. He sat on the ground, grimacing in pain, trying to wave the others off but unable to stand. Some of the recruits hesitated, torn between helping and finishing the drill on time. It was the same dilemma that training always presented. Do you choose the mission or the man? She didn't hesitate. She knelt beside him, checked the ankle quickly, then hoisted his arm over her shoulders and lifted him up. The pack on her back made the weight crushing, but she bore it without a sound, her muscles tightening as she adjusted her balance. "Come on," she said firmly, "we move." The recruit tried to protest, ashamed of slowing her down, but she shut him down with a glance. "We don't leave anyone behind." The others watched stunned. Some quickened their pace to avoid the responsibility, others lingered out of guilt. But she ignored them, moving steadily, one step at a time, carrying the weight of two people without losing her direction. Her breath came hard, her arms strained, but her focus never wavered. When they finally reached the designated checkpoint, the instructor there, a grizzled petty officer, took one look at the scene and gave a curt nod. "That's how it's done," he said flatly. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the night like steel. The recruits who had abandoned their injured teammate lowered their eyes in shame. She didn't bask in the moment, didn't gloat, only lowered the man gently to the ground and adjusted her pack again. "Get him to medical," she said simply, then turned back into the trees for the next coordinate. By the time the exercise ended at dawn, word had spread. The story of how she had carried an injured man through the woods traveled faster than the sun across the sky. Some recruits whispered it with admiration, others with resentment, but either way they spoke of her with a weight they hadn't before. She had proven something without speaking a word, that her tattoo wasn't an empty claim, it was a reality lived every single day. When she returned to the barracks, exhausted and mud-stained, the commander was waiting. He stood by the door, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. As she passed, he stopped her. "I heard what you did," he said. She didn't slow her stride. I did what anyone should have done. His eyes followed her steadily. No. You did what most wouldn't. She paused then just for a heartbeat before continuing inside. His words lingered behind her like a shadow, not because she needed his praise but because she knew he understood. That night, alone in her bunk, she stared at the ceiling once more, her body aching from the weight she had carried. But deep inside, she felt the familiar satisfaction of endurance, the quiet victory of doing what others couldn't or wouldn't. She thought of the chains in her tattoo, each one representing not just her own struggles but the moments when she had refused to let others fall. This night had added another chain in spirit, if not in ink. She smiled faintly at the thought, then closed her eyes, ready for whatever trial tomorrow would bring. The next day during assembly the commander addressed the unit. His voice carried across the field, steady and sharp. Yesterday one of you proved what it means to carry not just your own weight but the weight of others. That is the measure of a SEAL, not how loud you are, not how much you can lift alone, but whether you can endure for the man beside you. His eyes scanned the line of recruits until they landed on her, holding for just a second longer than anyone else. He didn't call her name, didn't point, but everyone knew who he meant. The silence that followed was heavy, and this time there was no laughter, no whispers. Only respect. The next day began with a heavy stillness that settled over the training compound. Dawn broke pale and quiet, the kind of morning where every sound felt magnified against the silence. Tanya sat at the edge of her bunk, lacing her boots slowly, her hands steady but her heart restless. She had spent the night replaying the moment when the SEAL commander had saluted her tattoo, and though pride lingered in her chest, she knew the fight wasn't over. Respect in the military was never given once, it had to be continually earned, tested, and proven again under pressure. When she stepped outside, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and faint diesel fuel from the generators. The other recruits were already gathered in formation, their eyes flicking toward her as she joined the line. Some offered nods of acknowledgement, subtle shifts that told her the atmosphere had changed. She wasn't the joke anymore. Yet she also felt the weight of expectation settle even heavier. Now that the commander himself had stood at attention before her tattoo, any weakness from her could be used as an excuse to dismiss that moment as luck or pity. She couldn't let that happen. The instructors arrived, their boots pounding against the gravel, voices sharp as knives cutting through the morning calm. Today, one of them barked, "You will push your bodies to the limit and beyond. The ocean will decide who belongs here and who doesn't." Tanya's stomach clenched, not from fear but from determination. She knew what was coming, surf torture. Hours in the freezing Pacific, locked arm in arm with her team, waves crashing over them, trying to strip the fight out of their bones. They marched toward the shoreline, the sun climbing slowly behind them. The beach stretched wide and merciless, the water foaming with an indifference that made even the toughest recruits shiver. Tanya caught sight of the commander standing off to the side, arms folded, his gaze following the unit. She wondered if he was here to watch her specifically or simply doing his duty. Either way it didn't matter. She was ready. The moment her body hit the icy surf, every nerve screamed. The shock of the cold clawed at her lungs, forcing her breath short and shallow. The recruits linked arms, forming a line, their bodies half submerged as waves rolled over their heads. "Lock it in," the instructor shouted. "If one of you breaks, you all pay." Tanya clenched her jaw, pressing her shoulder tighter against the recruit beside her. Her teeth rattled, but she forced herself to breathe, slow and deliberate. She thought of her tattoo, the roots, the heritage, the resilience it represented. She wasn't just enduring this for herself but for everyone who had doubted, mocked, or dismissed her. Minutes stretched into hours. The cold was merciless, turning limbs numb, grinding against resolve. Some recruits groaned, their voices carried away by the waves. One whispered that he couldn't feel his legs. Another's head drooped dangerously low. Tanya shifted her weight, supporting him subtly without drawing attention. She whispered back, "Don't quit. Don't you dare quit." The words weren't loud, but they carried enough conviction to jolt him upright again. An instructor paced along the line, yelling into their ears. "This is Hell Week, people. The ocean doesn't care about your excuses. Prove you deserve the..." This was the crucible where legends were forged. She refused to be washed away. At some point, the pain dulled into a strange calm. The body adapted, or maybe it simply surrendered, but the mind remained sharp. Tanya began to hum softly, a rhythm under her breath. At first, it was only for herself, a way to keep time and focus. But then the recruit next to her joined in, humming the same melody. Soon, another picked it up and then another, until the entire line of shivering recruits was vibrating with the sound of their unity. It wasn't loud, but it was defiant, a chorus against the sea. The instructors noticed, their brows tightening, but they didn't stop it. Even the commander's expression shifted slightly, though his face remained mostly unreadable. Tanya realized what had happened. Her tattoo might have been the spark, but now her presence was kindling something larger. She wasn't just surviving the training, she was shaping the spirit of the group. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the instructors ordered them out of the surf. They stumbled onto the sand, dripping and shivering, their bodies trembling like leaves in the wind. Tanya's legs nearly gave out, but she steadied herself, shoulders square, eyes forward. Around her, the others mirrored her posture, refusing to show weakness even as their teeth chattered. The commander stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the wet sand. He looked over the recruits one by one, his gaze pausing on Tanya. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and though he said nothing, she felt the weight of acknowledgement pass between them. This wasn't pity. This wasn't novelty. This was respect, solid and unshakable, earned in the crucible of the sea. Back at the compound, as the recruits changed into dry gear, whispers followed Tanya, not mocking this time but hushed admiration. One leaned toward another and said, "She held us together out there." Another nodded, murmuring, "Yeah, she's got something different." Tanya heard it all but kept her face neutral. Pride was a dangerous thing if you let it swell too much. Still, deep inside, she allowed herself a flicker of warmth. That night, as she lay in her bunk, muscles aching and body exhausted, Tanya traced her fingers lightly over the tattoo etched into her arm. The ink had always been her shield, her anchor. But now, it wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the team, to the bond that had been free. And in that realization, she understood something deeper. This journey wasn't only about proving herself. It was about leading others through their breaking points and teaching them the strength of holding on when every wave demanded surrender. Sleep claimed her soon after, heavy and dreamless. Tomorrow would bring new trials, new doubts, and new pain. But Tanya was ready. She had already proven she could stand tall under laughter, endure the storm of the sea, and turn weakness into unity. Whatever came next, she would face it the same way she always had, head high, unshaken, and unstoppable. The air inside the base shifted after that day, almost as if an invisible current of respect followed Amara wherever she went. The laughter was gone. The smirks were gone. The casual jokes that used to ripple behind her back evaporated like mist at sunrise. In their place came silence, then quiet acknowledgement, then open admiration. It was as though the entire barracks had been forced to re-evaluate what kind of woman stood among them. Amara had always been strong, had always carried herself with dignity, but now the others could not deny the truth that the SEAL commander himself had seen, the truth her tattoo carried, the truth of her worth. She wasn't used to being looked at with awe. She'd spent so long fighting to be treated as equal that being suddenly lifted up like some untouchable figure didn't feel natural. Yet, she bore it with grace, choosing not to let pride twist her. Instead, she worked even harder during drills. She pushed herself to exhaustion in every run, every combat simulation, every swim in the freezing waters. And in doing so, she showed the others that what the commander had honored was not just ink on her skin, it was the discipline, the resilience, and the fire behind it. Late one evening, while the unit gathered in the mess hall, silence fell as the commander himself walked in. Everyone stood, the natural instinct of soldiers in the presence of authority. But then his gaze fell on Amara, and his expression softened with something deeper than formality. He crossed the room, the sound of his boots echoing against the concrete floor. No one dared speak. He stopped by her table, nodded respectfully, and simply said, "Carry on." It was a small gesture, a simple phrase, but the weight of it struck every soul present. A commander acknowledging one soldier above the rest in front of all, it carried more meaning than speeches ever could. From that night, her reputation was sealed. Men who had once dismissed her now sought her advice during tactical exercises. Younger recruits whispered her name with something like reverence. And though Amara never asked for such attention, she recognized what it meant. She had become more than just a soldier, she was a symbol now. A symbol of endurance. A symbol of respect earned in the hardest way possible. But symbols, she knew, were also tested. And soon her test arrived. A high-stakes mission was announced, one that would demand everything of the unit. Intelligence reports confirmed a hostile cell had taken root in a region few dared to tread, a place where jungle swallowed technology and the enemy knew every route and river. Failure was not an option, for innocent lives hung in the balance. The commander gathered them, laid out the grim details and made it clear, this was not a drill. As the team prepared, tension ran like electricity through the air. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Maps were studied until the lines blurred. Every soldier knew the dangers. Amara stood at her locker, running her fingers over her tattoo, tracing the lines that had once been mocked. Now it was her anchor. It reminded her of the battles already won, of the strength already proven. She whispered quietly, a prayer more to herself than anyone listening, let me not falter now. The night of deployment was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to skin and choked the lungs. The helicopters roared like beasts against the black sky, carrying them into the unknown. Inside the cabin, soldiers sat strapped in silence, their faces pale with focus. Amara sat among them, calm, steady. The commander was there too, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, when they flicked to her, held that same respect from before, as though he trusted her spirit to be unbreakable. When they landed, chaos struck immediately. Gunfire shattered the stillness. Shadows darted between trees, and the jungle erupted in sound and fury. The unit moved with precision, returning fire, advancing yard by yard. Amara was in the thick of it, her every motion sharpened by instinct and training. At one point, when the team faltered under a sudden ambush, it was her voice that cut through the panic. Clear. Firm. Commanding. Hold the line. On me. She surged forward, drawing fire, her courage igniting the others to follow. Through mud, sweat and blood, hours blurred into one relentless struggle. But in the heart of that chaos, Amara stood unyielding. Every time the unit threatened to break, she became the pillar that steadied them. Every time despair crept in, her presence burned it away. By the time the sun clawed its way above the horizon, painting the jungle in red light, the hostile cell was shattered. The mission was brutal, but it was successful. When the survivors regrouped at the extraction point, battered and exhausted, silence fell again. And once more the SEAL commander did what no one expected. Standing before his bloodied, dirt-streaked soldiers, he turned to Amara and gave a salute, not as a superior to a subordinate, but as one warrior to another. The men and women around her watched, stunned, before one by one, they followed his example. 100 hands lifted in salute to the woman they had once mocked. Amara did not weep, though her chest burned with pride and humility. She only stood tall, her tattoo visible beneath torn fabric, and returned the salute with steady strength. In that moment, the laughter of the past was erased forever, and the truth was branded in every heart. Respect is not given, it is earned, and she had earned it beyond measure. Los Angeles ki upar wali rat gari t, lekanas kuneche sab kuch roshunna. Bombers ubitak por shihar par manla rahi the, unk engines ka garajna ek darawanagi ban chukatha. Sirens ki awaz hargali har building se takra kar gunjrahi t. Magarabike nyamanzer samni the, Ava ka lightning jet hawa main isagum raha the jays wajishi or denaya ka hisaho. Us ki steering par ava ka hathit namustikam the kulagta hai nahi the kuya walaki hai jisa kuch din peli log kate the 2 week for G-forces. Control tower ku andar sab ki nazrianus par t. Radar screen par ava ki flight ka trajectory bar blink karda, or unk sami dike raha the ku wa 12 bombers kudarmian akili lad rahi hai. Ek kabad ek, ava on par dive kardi for akanak pull up kardi, missiles launch kardi or apni jet ki gadi ace badhadi jays wajishi or speed dimension main gus gai ho. Do bombers fat chuk the teasra nachager rahada or samundar ki taraf lau karada hua tailspin main gaya. Colonel Davis control tower kuglas kasamni kara the, us kucher par ac fakar bari muskanti jo shayadas and kabi misses haina ki ho. Aseni radio setathea or ava ko call kia. Lightning 1 tum la ko bachalia high. Magara b dus bombers baki hain. Tum ready ho. Cockpit ko andar ava ka mate par pasina the, lekanas ki ankan steel ki terachamak rahi t. Usnek lama kalia kudesi kaha. Yehi mera wakt high. Yehi meri pechan high. Fur radio par jawab dia. Colonel, main ready ts din esi jab unhan any kaha the ku main kabi fly nahi kar sakti. Dusser pilots ubi runway par tayar ho gay the, ava ki himat any unhibi zinda kar dia the. Panch jets runway esi takeoff car gay or ava ku wingman ban gay. Magar ava be unka leader t, or sab ko pada the ku is mission ka asli boj uski kandhan par hi. Hawa ka yo. Dus bombers formation main aa rahi the, nache ki roshnian ko dek kar unki bombing ka nishana seated downtown la the. Ava any apni squad ko command D. Falcon 2, 3 unhain left flank isi roko. Main or 4 beach main guzenge. Sab disciplined raho, agar hamari gadi tut gai dishihar tabaho jaega. Sab any copy kaha or ava any apni jet ka throttle maximum par dal dia. Lightning jet ki engine ki cheek any cockpit ko hila.